So this is part two of the PowerPoint. So an example of a concentric contraction, the extension of the knee when kicking a ball in football, where there will be shortening the quadricep muscles. There would also be a concentric contraction in the hamstring group of muscles when bringing the leg backwards for knee flexion. Eccentric contraction would be found in the lowering portion of a squat where there's a lengthening of the gluteus maximus muscle. This would also be seen in the lowering phase of a bicep curl where the angle of the joint is increasing and the muscle is lengthening. So an isometric contraction would be seen in gymnastics in the exercise called the rings, where there's many isometric contractions such as in the deltoid, latissimus dorsi, abdominals and many other muscles to hold the gymnast in place when performing the movement. Isometric contraction also occurs in rugby during a scrum, where they're supporting a stationary weight for a period of time. Isokinetic contractions could be found when using some gym equipment, which allow a maximum resistance over a full range of motion. An example of this would be a lat pull down. So the structure of muscle fibers. Each muscle fiber is made up of contractile protein myofibrils. A myofibril is made up of a bundle of myofilaments, which is the same length of the muscle fiber of each of the muscle fiber. Each of these myofibril are made up of overlapping protein threads called myofilament. Skeletal muscle fiber is a long cell surrounded by a sarcolemma, which is a cell membrane which surrounds a muscle fiber. They're specialized for contraction as they enable the diffusion of oxygen and glucose for respiration, and they allow carbon dioxide out of the cell. Sliding muscle filament theory. So this theory looks at how muscles contract and relax on a cellular level. The contractions revolve around the sarcomere, which is a basic unit of striated muscle tissue, and is where a contraction and relaxation of muscle cell occurs. Inside the sarcomere is found thick filaments of actin and myosin. When the muscles are resting, two molecules form the actin filament in the sarcomere, and a sarcomere to stop the thick myosin filament from attaching. The two molecules which form around the actin filament are called troponin and tropomyosin. But when the body wants to contract a muscle, calcium ions are released from the sarcomere, which flush out the troponin and tropomyosin. This then allows the myosin to bind to the actin, and myosin causes the muscle to contract as it moves towards the middle of the sarcomere, which pulls both ends of the sarcomere together, creating a muscle contraction. For the bond to be broken, ATP is required, which is an energy unit for every living cell. This releases myosin and actin. If calcium is still present, then the binding of myosin and actin will happen again. But if it isn't, then troponin and tropomyosin will then bind again, preventing the cross bridge from occurring, and the muscles will go back into a relaxed state. So stages of sliding filament theory when contractions are occurring. So the brain sends messages to activate muscles. A message is sent along the pathway of nerves such as sensory neurons and motor neurons, which reach the myofibrils. The sarcomere releases calcium ions, which bind to troponin in the actin filaments, and this moves the troponin. This makes the muscle contract as the sarcomere becomes shorter and the other myofibrils contract at the same time. Myosin's thick filaments use ATP to provide energy to use cross bridges to ratchet onto the actin filaments. So stopping of muscle contractions through brain signaling, muscle filament theory. When we want our muscles to stop contracting, the brain sends a message along nerve pathways, and the impulse reaches myofibrils. Then ATP is used as an energy source to stop the thick myosin filaments from moving back and forth. Then the calcium ions return to the sarcomere. The troponin returns to the actin filament to stop the myosin from attaching, making the muscle movements stop. So neuron pathways and motor units. Muscles contract through signals sent from the CNS, which is spinal cord and brain. These signals then run across neuron pathways. When the brain sends a signal for a muscle contraction, the impulse runs along a pathway of neuron axons which link to each other through a synapse, which is caused by a chemical neurotransmitter. Sensory neurons receive information from receptor cells, and the sensory neurons then carry out electrical impulse to the brain, where the decision is made. The impulse runs through the CNS, which sends an impulse which starts running across motor neurons, which make up a motor unit. These motor units then work together to contract skeletal muscles in coordination. Sensory neurons carry information from extremities to the central nervous system. Motor neurons carry information from the CNS to our muscles to make them contract. They're specialized cells that transmit nerve impulses to a group of muscle fiber. They attach to a muscle fiber and neuromuscular junction, which is where the motor neuron passes information to the muscle fiber through nerve impulses. So, a sporting example of a neuron pathway. When a football player sees a ball, his receptor cells in his face, called the cranial nerves, will conduct the information and pass it on to sensory neurons, which will carry this information through the spinal cord in the brain. If it is a reflex, however, the brain will not process this information, and it will only pass through the spinal cord and then straight to the motor neurons. This is called a reflex arc. It's a voluntary decision. If it's a voluntary decision, the brain will then process this information and then carry out the information from the CNS to our muscles to make them contract, which is, in this case, to make the football player run after the ball. When the impulse is passed through the spinal cord, it could pass through relay neurons, which are found in the spinal cord. However, this doesn't happen in all electrical impulses, and then always pass through relay neurons. So action potential. Action potential is a positive charge found inside the nerve and muscle cell, and it helps move the impulse down the motor neuron and into the muscle fiber. The element that passes the signal down to the neuromuscular junction is called the axon. When a neurotransmission occurs, there is a small gap between the neuromuscular junction and end plate and the muscle fiber. This is called a synaptic cleft. The action potential cannot cross the synaptic cleft without a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, which is secreted into the synaptic cleft. If enough is secreted, the muscle action potential is created, which creates a contraction in the muscle. So all or none law. This is when a motor unit receives a stimulus that creates creates action potential that creates enough charge for all the muscle fibers within the motor unit to contract with the same force. But if it doesn't reach the amount for the action potential of all the muscle fibers to contract with the same amount of force, then none of the muscles will contract.